Okay, so imagine this. What if almost half the people hunting big game in early America were actually women?
It sounds pretty radical, right? But that's sort of the picture emerging from some really fascinating archaeology we're diving into today.
Yeah, we're looking at some new reports, and especially a study in science advances that are really making us rethink, those long-held ideas about who did what in ancient hunter-gatherer groups here in the Americas.
hmm And our goal really is to unpack what these discoveries mean. We're focusing particularly on this incredible find in Peru, a female hunter from, what, 9,000 years ago?
9,000 years, it's amazing. And what that tells us about how life might have been so different back then.
Exactly.
So the main discovery, this happened at a site called Wilamaya Patjxa, high up in the Andes in Peru. Can you sort of set the scene for us?
Sure thing. So picture this high-altitude site, Wilamaya Patjxa. Archaeologists there uncovered human remains. A young woman, they estimate she was probably only 17 to 19 years old when she died. Very. But the really stunning part was what she was buried with. Alongside her bones, they found this collection of tools that, well, they basically screamed, "Big game hunter."
A hunting toolkit. What kind of things are we talking about? What was in it?
Yeah, a toolkit. So think stone projectile points. These would have been the sharp tips for spears, likely launched using an atlatl.
Ah, the spear thrower, right. Gives you more power and range.
Exactly that. And there were also these larger, heavier stones, probably used for cracking open bones to get the marrow, maybe scraping hides too. And then smaller, really sharp-edged rocks, perfect for butchering meat.
Wow, you could almost picture it, but it's definitely an image that clashes a bit with that standard picture most of us have of early human societies, doesn't it?
That's exactly what hit Randall Haas, one of the lead archaeologists. He mentioned, that the traditional model is pretty fixed. Men hunt, women gather. So finding this young woman buried with such a clear hunting kit, it really challenged that basic assumption.
And wasn't there evidence of the animals they were hunting nearby as well?
Yes, absolutely. The site also contained bones from large mammals, things like taruca, that's a type of Andean deer, and vicuña, which is related to alpacas.
So, not small game. We're talking substantial animals.
Definitely. Big game.
Okay, so a teenage girl buried 9,000 years ago with the complete toolkit for hunting big game like deer and vicuña. It really forces you to question that whole strict man the hunter, woman the gatherer idea, at least for these early American groups.
It really does. It makes you wonder if we've been projecting our own, maybe more recent, ideas about gender roles back onto the deep past.
That's a great point. Like, maybe the way things were organized wasn't always the same. Was she just, a one-off, an exception? Or was something else going on?
And that leads us to the next step they took. Haas and the team, they didn't just stop with this one amazing burial.
Right, they brought in the search, I heard.
They did. They conducted a meta-analysis, basically a huge review looking back at burial sites across North and South America reported over the last, say, 50 years.
50 years of data. Wow.
Yeah, and they were specifically looking for other cases where individuals were buried with these kinds of big game hunting tools.
And what did that wider look reveal? Did they find other examples?
They did, and the numbers are quite striking. So they identified 27 individuals total buried with definite big game hunting gear, projectile points, atlatl parts, things like that.
Okay, 27 individuals across the Americas.
And get this, out of those 27, they found that 11 were women.
11 out of 27.
11 women, 16 men.
That's way more than you'd expect based on the old model, almost 40% women.
Exactly. It's a significant proportion. Haas basically concluded that these figures strongly suggest something, well, different, as he put it, was going on in these really early groups compared to maybe more recent hunter-gatherer societies we know about.
Okay, 11 out of 27. That's compelling stuff. It wasn't just one unusual burial. So if this was more common, what could explain it? Why might hunting roles have been less divided by sex back then?
Well, there are a few interesting ideas floating around. One possibility, highlighted by archaeologist Shannon Tushingham, is that group hunting might have been the norm.
Like everyone pitching in?
Sort of. Think about taking down large, dangerous animals. Having more people involved, men, women, maybe even older children, would seriously improve your chances of success and survival.
Makes sense. Safety in numbers and more hands on deck. What else?
Another factor could be something called alloparenting.
Alloparenting, meaning
Shared childcare. If raising kids wasn't just the mother's job, if other community members, maybe grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, were heavily involved.
right, then mothers would have potentially had more time and freedom to participate in other crucial activities, like hunting.
Precisely. It frees people up. And then there's the technology itself.
The Atlatl.
Yeah, the Atwal, the spear thrower, it was the main long-range hunting tech back then. The researchers suggest it might have been something you could learn relatively quickly.
Easier to master, perhaps?
Potentially, yes. Maybe easier to become proficient before, say, females typically focus more heavily on child-rearing. This contrasts with something like the bow and arrow, which came later and often requires much more sustained practice to get really good.
Huh. That's a fascinating link between the tools they had and who might have used them effectively. Never thought about it that way.
It really makes you consider all the angles, and it also brings up the tricky issue of bias, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, the possibility that researchers in the past might have just assumed that hunting tools found with female remains could mean she was a hunter. Maybe they looked for other explanations because of their own, contemporary ideas about gender roles. Ethnographic bias, they call it.
So seeing the past through the lens of the present, basically.
Exactly. We have to be careful about that. And it's worth noting this isn't like the only finding challenging old ideas about gender roles in antiquity.
Oh. Are there other examples?
Yeah, think about those discoveries in Mongolia. Xianbai women from centuries ago who were clearly skilled archers and horse riders. Some evidence even suggests military training or involvement.
Right, so it's not just in the Americas. This idea of more fluid roles might have been more common than we thought.
It seems that way. Like Shannon Tushingham said, these findings are really showing that gender roles were much more flexible in the past, especially way back in the early Americas.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into that Science Advances paper specifically. What was the really solid evidence they presented for WMP6, the female hunter at Wilamaya Patjxa? How did they nail it down?
Well, they built a really strong case, layer by layer. First off, the burial itself, WMP6, they established what's called a secure stratigraphic association, meaning the toolkit and the body were found together in an undisturbed layer of soil. It shows they were definitely buried together at the same time. It wasn't like the tools fell in later or got mixed up.
Crucial point. So you know they belong together.
Absolutely crucial. Then, confirming the individual was female. They didn't just rely on one thing. They used osteology, studying the bones. Her skeleton, especially the thigh bones, had more gracile or slender, features typically associated with females.
Okay, so the bones suggested female.
Suggested, yes. But then they went further. They used proteomics.
Proteomics on tooth enamel.
Exactly. Analyzing the proteins preserved in her tooth enamel. Think of it like a molecular signature. They found proteins specific to females and, importantly, an absence of proteins only found in males.
Wow. So combining the bone analysis and this protein analysis.
Right. It gives them extremely high confidence that WMP6 was biologically female. No real room for doubt there.
That sounds incredibly thorough. What else did they figure out about her?
They looked at her diet. Using isotope analysis on her bones, combined with the animal bones found at the site, they showed she ate a mix of land-based plants and animals.
Consistent with being part of a hunting-gathering group.
Yes. And importantly, not a diet primarily focused on plants, which you might expect under the old gatherer-only model.
Right.
And remember those taruca, the Andean deer? They actually found fragments of taruca bone in the soil that filled her grave pit.
Another direct link to the big game.
A very direct link. Plus, the overwhelming majority of animal bones at the whole site were from large mammals like taruca and vicuña. It was clearly a big game hunting site.
Okay, and did they know if she was, local to the area or someone who just passed through?
Good question. They looked at oxygen and carbon isotopes in her bones, too, which can tell you about the environment someone lived in. Their analysis suggested she was likely a permanent, year-round resident of that high-altitude landscape.
So all signs point to a young woman who lived high in the Andes year-round, ate meat from large animals, and was buried with a full big-game hunting kit. Pretty compelling.
Extremely compelling.
And you mentioned another burial, WMP1, a male. How did his situation compare?
Right, WMP1. They identified him as male, older, maybe 25 to 30, and he was found with some projectile points.
Okay, so another potential hunter.
Potentially. But the context was different. The points weren't neatly arranged as a single toolkit, like with WMP6. They were found sort of scattered in the burial fill around him. So the association wasn't as definitive. It's harder to say for sure they were intentionally buried with him as his personal gear in the same way.
Okay. So while interesting, the evidence for WMP6 being a hunter, buried with her tools, is much stronger, much clearer.
Much clearer, yes. And that ties back into their statistical analysis in the paper, too.
The one looking at the 11 women out of 27 hunters.
Exactly. They ran the numbers and showed that finding that many female hunters is statistically really improbable if women only participated in big game hunting, say, less than 30% of the time.
So the math backs up the idea that female participation wasn't just occasional, but likely substantial.
It suggests a much more, maybe, gender-neutral approach to hunting, or at least significantly higher female participation than previously assumed for these early American groups.
Okay, you have to acknowledge, though, burial practices can be complex, right? People get buried with things for all sorts of reasons.
Absolutely. That's a fair point, and something archaeologists always grapple with. Burial rituals are symbolic, complex, but the sheer completeness and nature of the toolkit with WMP6 make alternative explanations less likely. Things like maybe the tools belonged to someone else killed with her, or it was an accident. It just doesn't fit as well when you have this intact set of specialized hunting gear placed with the body.
And historically, as you mentioned, there might have been this reluctance to even consider hunting tools found with women as evidence of hunting.
Right. There might have been a bias towards explaining it away. Plus, the robust sex determination here using both bones and proteins really minimizes the chance they simply misidentified the sex.
So taking everything together, the WMP6 burial combined with that broader meta-analysis.
It really supports a model where, in these early Holocene populations in the Americas, labor related to subsistence, especially big game hunting, wasn't as rigidly divided by sex as we used to think. It might have been much more flexible, much more communal.
Okay, let's wrap this up. If you had to boil it down, what's the single most important thing we should take away from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is that this idea of fixed, unchanging gender roles, men hunt, women gather, just doesn't hold up when you look closely at the evidence from deep antiquity, especially in the early Americas. It's being seriously challenged.
Yeah, it feels like a genuine aha moment, discovering that early women weren't just gathering plants, but were likely right there, actively hunting large animals, contributing significantly to their group's survival. It changes the whole dynamic.
It absolutely does. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over.
Go for it.
If our understanding of something as basic as how people got their food, the division of labor, has been so shaped by perhaps our own modern biases, what else about the past might we be getting wrong? What other assumptions are baked into our view of history that might crumble when we find new evidence like this? How does knowing gender roles were potentially much more fluid change how we think about human potential, about society, not just in the past, but maybe even today?
That's a powerful question to end on. Really makes you think about the stories we tell ourselves about where we came from.